It's been a week of massive wealth building for early investors of SpaceX, but this is just the beginning. There are two more historic opportunities coming yet this year. Joining us today is Luke Lango from InvestorPlace with a breakdown of the next two massive IPOs coming to the market later this year and how investors can get in early and gain the most benefit ahead of those IPOs. So Luke, we will get into both Anthropic and OpenAI later on in this video, and the unique ways that you have for investors to really get in early on those names. First, we're going to talk about SpaceX, and I feel like that get in early story is really playing out right now in these first few days of trade for SpaceX. This company has set a wild precedent for what the first few days of trade can really look like on an IPO of this size.
Yeah, I mean, the SpaceX IPO has been a huge success. Now, part of that is by design. It's just mechanics that only 5% of the float is tradable right now. That's just the way IPOs go, right? When you first launch, very few shares are actually tradable. So that creates a lot of buying pressure, right? There's a lot of demand to get exposure to SpaceX, not a lot of supply of shares that are tradable out there right now. And so you get a supply-demand imbalance, and that's just kind of a mechanical flow that pushes the stock higher. So that's definitely happening. We get some unlocks in August that'll change that a little bit. So we'll see how it acts then. But beyond that, I think it's just fundamentally very impressive that a company IPOs at 100 times sales multiple and then goes up another 50, 60% in a few days. The fact that there is a demand-supply imbalance is really amazing. And I think that speaks to investors really believing in this broader vision that Elon has for SpaceX, and also kind of puts to bed these fears that these IPOs are just going to be this massive retail dump. Like, that was a big fear that was circulating online, is that the insiders are going to dump on the retail investors and SpaceX and OpenAI and Anthropic, and it's all going to be retail holding the bag. And I think the first few days of trading of SpaceX definitely suggests that that's not the case.
Yeah. Do you think that story could change? That's the big question. Again, that theory is something I hear from our viewers all the time is what if we are all left holding the bag on this one? I'm staying away from SpaceX. I'm going to wait to see how it shakes out 3 months, 6 months down the road. Do you think that scenario where a lot of the big investors dump out of the stock could still happen 3 to 6 months down the road? Or does it appear like this is a story that's just getting started for SpaceX?
I mean, I think a little bit of both, right? Because I think once you get the unlock in August and you get more shares in September, October, November, I just feel like, yeah, some insiders are going to sell. Like, absolutely. If you're an employee, an engineer that's been there for 5, 10, 15 years, and you're making 100, 200 grand a year, 300 grand a year, and all of a sudden your stock is worth 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 million or more, then yeah, you're going to take some of those profits off the table. That's 5, 10, 15 years of work that's invested in that, and boom, all right, let's take some profits off the table and go enjoy life a little bit. So I think that's definitely going to happen, and that's going to create volatility in the stock in the back half of the year. But looking past those short-term trading dynamics and just insiders wanting to, finally get some money out of this thing, I think a lot of insiders will keep the majority of their holdings because they do believe in the future of the business, and I believe in the future of the business. I think the question is, do you think there's an economic opportunity beyond Earth? And if the answer to that question is yes, then you have to value SpaceX at an obscenely high valuation because they're the gatekeeper to that opportunity. I mean, they're doing 300, 400 launches a year. No one else is doing 15 or 20. So they are the transport mechanism to an economic opportunity in space. The debate is, how big is that opportunity? I think it's very large. I think orbital data centers are going to be very big. I think point-to-point space travel is going to be very large. I think there is definitely opportunity for outer space manufacturing, outer space energy generation as well, and harvesting. The Mars stuff, a little bit more iffy on, but I think just without the Mars and Moon stuff, I think there is still a massive opportunity out there. Geospatial intelligence, monitoring, broadband networking, the Starlink stuff. I think that the telcos, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile are kind of actually screwed. I think Starlink kind of eats their lunch, or AST Space Mobile. And so I think that there's massive opportunities in space. And if you believe everything I just said, then you have to value SpaceX at a very high valuation because, again, the only way to get there is SpaceX. Blue Origin tried and they've blown up a couple times, and NASA is not at all at the scale it needs to be. So the only way to get there, Rocket Lab is okay, but they're smaller rockets. SpaceX is the gatekeeper.
What I'm hearing there, Luke, is it doesn't sound like you're signing up for that first trip to Mars if it actually comes. Is that right?
What I'll do is I'll buy my Optimus robot and I'll send him up there as a test buddy.
See how that goes. All right. Well, you covered a lot of really important points there about like the potential potential market that SpaceX could have, that there's a lot of economic opportunities for what they are building, but that's not here yet. It takes a lot of capital, it takes a lot of time to build all of those infrastructure, potentially commercial opportunities that you just talked about. Do you think that the time horizon for SpaceX will pay off for investors who are getting in super early on this IPO right now?
The best way to play it right now is SpaceX until the lockup. And then once the lockup expires, I think you're going to want to shift the supply chain plays. And I think the second half of 26 is not going to be about SpaceX going to the moon. It's going to be about, Elon Musk just raised $85 billion. That's $85 billion in cash. That's going to go somewhere. That's going to go towards building, like you said, the infrastructure necessary, buying the components, the supply stuff necessary to realize this vision of orbital data centers, to realize this vision of reusable rockets, to realize this vision of TerraFab, that big vertically integrated semiconductor manufacturing facility that they're building in Texas. So that money's going to go towards creating that infrastructure. And it's going to look very much like the AI infrastructure trade, right? That we all started using ChatGPT and we all started using Claude and we all started using Grok and Gemini and all these frontier AI models. And while Microsoft has been a decent stock to buy and Google has been a decent stock to buy, the real value in that trade has been where are the checks being written. Microsoft's writing $100 billion checks. Google is doing the same. Amazon is doing the same. There are more than $1 trillion being spent annually on this stuff. Where is that money flowing? Those have been the biggest winners. The optics plays, Coherent, Corning, the power plays, GE Vernova, construction plays like Caterpillar. Those have been the biggest winners of the AI trade. And so I think now we're getting into like a space AI trade. And the biggest winners, at least in the first leg of this, won't be actually SpaceX. I think SpaceX is a great long-term play, but I think in the next 6 months, you're going to get much more upside in the companies that can supply stuff to SpaceX. SpaceX takes all this money, this $85 billion. Where does that go? Because once they spend that money, it's very interesting that ahead of the IPO in May, T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T announced a joint venture to create a direct-to-satellite communication network. There's competition here, right? Google is talking to SpaceX about launching data centers into space. Google has a project going on with Planet Labs called Suncatcher about launching a data center into space in 2027. So SpaceX getting that $85 billion, they don't get that $85 billion in a vacuum. They get that $85 billion in a very competitive world amongst multiple very competitive races with big stakes at the end. And so Microsoft starts spending more on this stuff. Google starts spending more on this stuff. The telco starts spending more on this stuff. And I think this is actually a starting point for massive investment in space AI infrastructure things, which will create a massive demand wave for the stock to supply those things.
This is such great advice for our listeners today who are looking at where to capture some of the growth and all the money going into this space sector right now. And I think the infrastructure plays are such a great point to consider, especially over the next 6 months or so versus these long-term outlook stories. But while SpaceX might be a better long-term play and will actually benefit once that commercialization happens a few years down the road and the infrastructure's there, right now, for those investors who got in early on SpaceX, whether they were in before the IPO or if they got that initial IPO offering, it seems like a really good investment today anyway. If you're looking at where the stock is right now, it reached 220 earlier today. So clearly, if you got in on this investment at 135 or were ahead of the IPO, it seems like a very good early investment for investors looking at where the stock is today.
Yeah, I would agree entirely. And I think the long-term potential is there. I mean, 220 will be 500, 600, 700, 800 within the next 3 to 4 years. So I think this stock is a great long-term winner. Just be aware that there's going to be second half volatility when a lot of shares get unlocked. That will happen. Don't let that scare you out of the bull thesis.
Yeah, the long-term payoff is here, but short-term, there are definitely some people and investors who are making money right now who got in early on SpaceX. And that is what we're going to talk about in the rest of this video. And I know, Luke, you and your team at InvestorPlace have really dove into how to get into these massive IPO stories early, the backdoor entry into investing in these companies before they go public. And there's 2 more coming. As big as SpaceX has been, record-breaking historic IPO, we have 2 other massive IPOs coming potentially yet this year. So we're going to dive into both of those. And I know you have some ideas on how to get in early on some of those names too and why it's important. So again, if you want to check out Luke's full special report on exactly this, how to get into these next two massive IPOs before they actually go public, scan the QR code or click the link in the description. Again, InvestorPlace is all about these massive growth stories, and Luke has a really unique way of doing that. So you can check out his full report by going to that link in the description. Luke, let's get into that next massive IPO that you are watching. It's the one that everybody is talking about, Anthropic. Do you think that this is really happening yet this year?
Yeah, I mean, Anthropic is definitely going public this year. They've filed their prospectus to go public, confidentially with the SEC. I think it IPOs at a valuation of over $1 trillion, probably close to 1.5 would be my guess. I think it's going to happen in the fourth quarter of this year, probably October, November. People would like to IPO in December, so I'd say October, November. And I think it's going to be a massive success, like the SpaceX IPO has been a massive success. What you have to understand is the demand for these companies is, I mean, as we've seen with SpaceX, it's ridiculously large. There are no other companies in the public market like them, right? SpaceX, Rocket Lab is the closest proxy, but that's not really. I mean, SpaceX is the gatekeeper to the new space economy. And then in terms of frontier AI models, Gemini is good. I get that, owned by Google. Gemini is good. But in terms of the consumer sphere and the enterprise sphere, there are two titans in the space. It's ChatGPT and Claude. And those are owned by OpenAI and Anthropic, neither of which are public. So if you really wanted exposure to the true cutting edge of AI, the frontier AI model makers, you haven't been able to get true direct exposure until they IPO. And so I think the demand there is going to be very, very large. And then again, you're going to have lockup. So supply on the share side is going to be pretty small. And that's going to create a supply-demand imbalance that'll shoot these IPOs much higher than their IPO prices. And so I think, yes, Anthropic is going to have a very successful IPO in the fourth quarter of this year, powered by what we're going to see in their numbers, ridiculous growth in Claude.
And the growth story is very real here. We all know that. But until we can see those public numbers, I think that's really going to tell the story. We'll talk about how investors can look at getting into Anthropic before that IPO. We're going to get to that in just a second. But I want to talk about how massive Anthropic is and the impact this company has already had on the market. Let's talk about that software apocalypse we had at the start of the year. That was really all due to Anthropic. You can see the waves this not public company is already putting in the market. Do you think that that's just going to continue the rest of this year?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pulling up the chart right now. I mean, those software stocks got absolutely destroyed, and then they had a pretty decent bounce in April and May, but now they've come retreating back down. 110 was a top on IGV, that software ETF, and now we're back down to 90 and still falling. So I'm a big believer, I guess would be the word, in the SaaS apocalypse, because I'm a big believer in Claude, and I'm a big believer in ChatGPT, and I'm a big believer in Grok, I'm a big believer in Gemini, that these off-the-shelf LLMs, these frontier AI models, are highly capable, and they can do, I would say, 80 to 90% of what most software services can do currently. And then the argument for the software stuff is like, well, they have value adds and there's higher tiers and all that stuff. But when you look at 80 to 90% of their users, they don't use those higher tiers. People use Salesforce for the most basic Salesforce operations. People use Monday.com for the most basic Monday.com operations. They use all these other platforms for the most basic of the operations. Only 10 to 20% of the users actually go up the tier and use the value add offerings. And so that's why 80 to 90% will churn. And so I do believe that, like, where's all the value from Anthropic coming? It's coming out of the software sector. I think it'll continue to come out of the software sector. So I do think the Anthropic IPO will be a negative catalyst for IGV, for software stocks, for Salesforce, Adobe, Intuit. The IRS had to issue a warning this year telling people not to do their taxes with ChatGPT and Claude. And the fact that they had to issue that warning tells you exactly everything you need to know, which is a lot of people were doing their taxes with ChatGPT and Claude. And while the IRS might not like it this year, those platforms will only get better and better and better. And soon enough, the guidance will be, all right, go ahead and use them because the demand's so overwhelming and the capabilities are so high. So that's where I stand on the SaaS apocalypse, SaaS Mageddon story.
Yeah, the fact that this company can disrupt an entire sector worth billions, trillions of dollars just shows how much power there is in this company and how much of a disruptor Anthropic is to the entire market, not just Anthropic, OpenAI as well. But we're getting to that one next. But with Anthropic, let's talk about every investor out there wants to get a piece of this company before it's actually public. Will the vast majority of retail investors be able to do that in some way? Or what are you looking at as an opportunity to try to get ahead of this IPO story for Anthropic?
Yeah, so in the last 2 to 3 years, a unique type of investment vehicle has emerged, which allows people to gain pre-IPO exposure to a lot of these companies, whether it's SpaceX, Anthropic, OpenAI, Andural's another one that people think may go public this year or next year. What they basically are publicly traded venture capital firms. So they are venture capital firms that have bought stakes in or invested in these startups, a variety of startups, and then they go public and they have a publicly traded stock attached to their VC fund. And then they report companies report EPS every quarter, revenues every quarter. These companies report their net asset value every quarter, NAV, which is, take up all our investments, divide it by per share. What's the value of that? That's your net asset value. And so that's how these stocks or these ETFs trade, these vehicles trade. And they're pretty new, but they're very popular and they're a very good way to gain exposure to SpaceX before the IPO. There were a couple that had that exposure that did very well before the IPO. There are a couple that have Anthropic. There are a couple that have OpenAI. And I expect those to do equally well going into those IPOs in the fourth quarter of this year.
Okay, very interesting. And I know you dive into exactly that playbook of how to do that and how to get a piece of that in that special report. So again, I just talked about it, but if you want to go check that out yourself after this video, scan the QR code, click the link in the description. Again, in the special report from Luke, he really walks through that step by step. So great information already, Luke. I want to talk about some other ways that investors are looking at Anthropic, and that's through some of those other companies that might rise alongside Anthropic once that IPO comes, or at least leading up to it. We saw that story play out with SpaceX, where any space adjacent stock skyrocketed in the weeks before the SpaceX IPO. And now we're seeing the opposite happen. Many of those space stocks are completely losing all of the momentum they had leading up to the SpaceX IPO. Do you think we could see a similar story with another group of stocks when Anthropic's IPO comes later this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 100%. Everyone is buying proxies before they can buy the real thing. And then when the real thing becomes available, they ditch the proxies and just buy the real thing. That's just mechanical. That's how the flows work. And so with the SpaceX IPO, if you use that as a template for OpenAI and Anthropic, so talking about the pre-IPO vehicles for SpaceX, there were two out there. There was the TEMA Space Innovators ETF, ticker NASA, NASA, and there was the Destiny 100 Fund, ticker DXYZ. And both of those went absolutely parabolic before the IPO. I mean, I think NASA went 25 to, maybe 45-ish. And then DXYZ had an even bigger, it went massive run. That one went from 25 to 70, 80. So these things went on massive runs, but then they retraced and gave back almost all of those gains post IPO, because once the real thing's available, you stop buying the proxy. So I think you're going to see a potentially similar thing happen with OpenAI and Anthropic. Absolutely. Those pre-IPO vehicles could double, triple, quadruple, or more into those IPOs and then give back half or more of those gains in the weeks after the IPO because the real thing becomes available, so you ditch the proxy. And then with the space stocks, more of an indirect proxy on them, Rocket Lab, Planet Labs, AST Space Mobile, Black Sky, Redwire, etc. Those also, they followed a similar trajectory, but lower beta. They weren't as high octane. And they're giving back some of their gains as well. I think those ones definitely reverse course and rebound dramatically. And when you look at Anthropic and OpenAI, what are those proxies? Well, I mean, you could see software sell off. It could be an anti-proxy, right? The opposite, right? Like you could see software sell off like crazy into the Anthropic IPO and then all of a sudden get a bit of a recovery bounce on the IPO. I think you could see something like Microsoft or Amazon, who's a big investor in Anthropic, Microsoft, big investor in OpenAI. They're big investors. NVIDIA is a big investor in OpenAI. You could see those stocks get a nice lift into the IPO and then sell off a little bit post-IPO. So the same dynamics that played out with SpaceX, I expect those things to play out with Anthropic and with OpenAI in the fourth quarter of this year, albeit with a different set of stocks.
A really good prediction and look ahead to what could happen. I think that's where there's a lot of money to be made, especially for people who are looking to do a short-term gain on some of these names, and seeing history repeat itself in the same year makes a lot of sense. We saw this in the space stocks. I think that the markets that you talked about could absolutely rise and fall along with this Anthropic IPO, but also that OpenAI IPO. Let's move on to that a little bit. When is OpenAI supposed to be IPOing?
I mean, it's a race to IPO between OpenAI and Anthropic. Anthropic, like I said, the two leading frontier AI model makers out there. I think both go public in the fourth quarter of this year. Who beats who to the punch? I don't know. I think OpenAI has a bit more of a competitive bone in them, so maybe they beat Anthropic to the punch. Maybe they're earlier in Q4. Anthropic's more mid Q4. I think that valuation will also be close to $1.5 trillion or more by the time we get there. And I think that IPO will be also very successful because of supply-demand imbalances.
I think when we're talking about two massive companies going public at the same time and that amount of money flowing into both of these names, the money has to come from somewhere. I'm wondering what you expect to happen with other areas of the market. Will trading among other names really just slow down? Will that volume decrease on the rest of the market, kind of like we saw with the first day of SpaceX IPO? It just has to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah, so I think it'll come from different directions. I think you saw a lot of the liquidity for the SpaceX IPO come from cryptos. Bitcoin had a pretty big drop, and actually the whole crypto complex had a pretty big drop going into the IPO. And it's recovered a little bit since, but not a lot. So I think a lot of money left crypto, went on the sidelines, and then entered the SpaceX IPO. And that makes sense because you would expect, I mean, when you think about like Elon believers and Elon fanatics among the retail crowd, qualitatively, based on investors I've talked to, that seems to have heavy overlap with like the crypto fanatic crowd of 2020 and 2021. So it makes sense that the flows from crypto now turn into flows for SpaceX. I think the flows for OpenAI and Anthropic come from big tech. I don't think that there's a lot of overlap between like OpenAI fanatics and Anthropic fanatics and the crypto crowd. Maybe there's some, but I think there's a lot of overlap between big tech investors and OpenAI and Anthropic fans. And I also think there are a lot of people out there that just bought Microsoft because of its OpenAI exposure. And there are a lot of people out there that just bought Amazon for its Anthropic exposure. Google is a little different because they have Gemini, but if you're a big tech company without a frontier AI model, which would be Microsoft, Amazon, they're trying to build their own, but more or less they don't really have a standalone, very capable frontier AI model. Then that is where I think the selling pressure happens. And you get selling there and then buying of the IPO. So I think big tech provides a lot of the liquidity for the Anthropic and OpenAI IPOs, whereas cryptos provided the liquidity for SpaceX.
Unlike the SpaceX story that we saw play out, where these space stocks all rose and then fell as the IPO came, because like you said, SpaceX is the real thing, and these other companies are doing a fraction of the amount of launches and the amount of advancements that SpaceX is doing. But I feel like the story between big tech and Anthropic and OpenAI is a little different because they're so interconnected. So if we see a pullback in those big tech stocks around the IPO of both of these massive companies, do you think that's a time investors should be looking to buy the dip in big tech? Will Anthropic and OpenAI launching actually long-term benefit the big tech names that you just mentioned? Or could it be a more long-lasting pullback and a continued pullback for some of these big tech names?
Yeah, it would be a buying opportunity. Every pullback in big tech's a buying opportunity. That will not be true at some point, but it will remain true for the rest of this year and likely into 27, probably for the next few years as well. Big tech is dominant. Big tech is investing where they need to invest. Big tech is securing their long-term competitive positions in their critical markets. They're building very wide moats. They're developing infrastructure that nobody else can. The AI infrastructure nobody else can build at this scale because they don't have the money that these guys do. They're in a very good position. And any short-term selling pressure, I would say in any of these names, Apple's a little different because they don't have the infrastructure component going for them. A lot of people like Apple because they're not spending heavy on CapEx. I don't like them as much because they're not doing that. I think the infrastructure spending is a massive long-term competitive strength and advantage. So Apple's a little bit different. But when you talk about Meta, when you talk about Amazon, when you talk about Microsoft, when you talk about Google or Alphabet, any short-term weakness in those names, in my view, is a buying opportunity. And any short-term weakness we see from the IPOs would be a buying opportunity too.
All right, buy the dip in big tech. It's still the story, at least for the next couple of years anyway. Let's get to this OpenAI IPO a little bit more and that how to get in before it launches. You know, one thing we talked about very early on here is talking about this is a really, truly a great wealth opportunity in the market for investors. Some people felt like if you missed the AI investment story, you've missed out on the last wealth opportunity for retail investors. But now we're just seeing these huge LLM companies going public for the first time. That feels like potentially one of those last great wealth opportunities. Do you think that investors need to get in really early on this IPO story for both OpenAI and Claude to get a piece of that massive gains that are expected once these companies go public?
Yeah, I think investors need to get in on the AI AI just boom that is happening, and it'd be really nice if they also were able to get some pre-IPO exposure or play the IPOs of Anthropic and OpenAI in unique ways outside of just buying the IPOs on IPO day or buying the stocks on IPO day. These are very big events. They're high torque events. And I am particularly excited about OpenAI because I think there's a really good comeback story there. A lot of investors have kind of said, okay, OpenAI is dead and Anthropic is eating their lunch, and ChatGPT is yesterday's best story and Claude is today's best story. But Claude's been rate limiting a lot of people a lot. They have the Fable 5 stuff and the Mythos stuff that's going on, and it got export controlled, and now we can't use the model. There's just some weird stuff happening there. And then at the same time, OpenAI launched ChatGPT 5.5, which is a really, really, really capable model. I've never been rate limited on ChatGPT. I use them both a lot, and I've never been rate limited on ChatGPT. I would love to see in the comments if other people have. I have not heard of anybody getting rate limited on ChatGPT. It seems to be a more efficient way to get things done now here in June of 2026. And then you have the politics angle to it all. That there's the news report, or actually not news report, confirmation from President Trump himself that the White House may be looking to take stakes in these frontier AI companies. When he says that, I mean, there's really only two, like I said, out there. There's OpenAI and there's Anthropic, and the government hates Anthropic. Okay, I mean, the government and Anthropic do not get along at all. David Sachs, the AI czar, or the former AI czar for Trump, for the White House, is always ridiculing Claude and Anthropic on X or on his All In podcast or wherever he can. He hates the company. I think Trump hates the company too. Back in the Department of War, they had the big, miscommunication or disagreement, whatever, a lot of do. So when Trump says that, what he really means is we're talking to Sam Altman, we're talking to OpenAI, we may invest in OpenAI. That's what he means when he says that. And so I think that before this IPO happens, the White House is going to take a stake in OpenAI. And if that were to happen before the IPO, then I can guarantee you these pre-IPO vehicles, the ones that doubled before the SpaceX IPO in a matter of weeks, are going to go ballistic for OpenAI. If you have this window between White House invests, let's say in late summer, and then you have the IPO in Q4, you have 2 to 3 months there where I think a lot of money is going to flow into the proxy trades for OpenAI. I get really excited about that IPO. So I think that story is actually maybe the most exciting of the three this year, which sounds counterintuitive and against the consensus today. But I think come late summer, going into Q3, I think people will really start to understand that, and the money will really start to flow into those proxy trades for OpenAI, which again, there are some pre-IPO vehicles out there. I don't want to really drop the tickers here because that's where they're in that special report, but there are some pre-IPO vehicles out there that have really robust OpenAI exposure. There are some supply chain suppliers. There are some ecosystem partners. Obviously, Microsoft is the big way to do it, but that's not my favorite. That's probably my least favorite way to play it. There are a lot higher torque, better ways, better OpenAI proxy trades out there that I think could go ballistic in the second half of this year.
Yeah, again, a lot of those tickers and that step-by-step how to get in on these two massive LLM IPOs later this year. You can scan the QR code, click the link in the description, and get that special report from Luke. Again, it's a special offer just for our listeners here on MarketBeat. So thank you, Luke, so much for sharing a lot of great predictions on where you think the market could head with these IPO stories this year. Luke also had a really great prediction on what he thinks Elon's empire will look like in just a short time, what the SpaceX, Tesla, Optimus Robotics story could look like. You can watch that full interview here and get his take on where SpaceX could be heading next. You can click that video here.